All right, so since we just had a sponsor break, before I jump into that, we're going to take a good 30-second stretch. So in order to prevent you from bumping into your neighbors, if you're able, if you want to just stand up, no joke, stand up, and just do a nice like stretch, loosen up the shoulders, and just, yeah. How many of you realized how much tension you were holding in your shoulders? You can sit down. So sometimes we go throughout our day and we don't actually realize just how much, even if we're enjoying ourselves, right? We were all just clapping for the conference, that we're just slowly like hunching, but Smeagol style. It's a little uncomfortable, but happens so slowly we don't even realize when we've gone from Gollum to Smeagol. It's a little unfortunate, or vice versa. And that's a bit what it's like when we're trying to monitor things, right? Because if you've ever worked at a startup, you may have encountered this scenario or a subset of it. Right? You're like, oh, I need to hook things into, we'll pick on Slack. We need to hook things into Slack. We need to know when alerts are going off. We need to know when someone's emailing about something important. We need to know about Trello or Jira or wherever. And then HR is like, human ops are great, so let's announce birthdays and babies too. And before you know it, you're just like, I need to close Slack or I can't work. And that's unfortunate. And it's unfortunate because you've just buried a whole source of information. And what happens when engineers bury whole sources of information is that now you no longer have that information, right? So if you have things pumping through Slack and then something actually needs to notify you, either a person, like a coworker who just needs to talk to you, or maybe a system that's been plugged in that way, you're not going to get that notification at all. And if any of you heard the Target fiasco from a few years ago, this is basically what happened. It wasn't necessarily Slack, but what happened was they had such noisy systems that they started muting things without actually paying attention to whether they needed to be muted or not, because they just couldn't keep track of all that information, which means they ran into this, which is also unfortunate, because they made it quiet without making it quiet. And that's not a situation we want to have either. So what do we do to avoid making things artificially quiet so that we can actually trust the silence and get our work done without shutting things down completely? And we're going to take a little sideways step here and talk a little bit about noise itself, right? So we're talking about noise not necessarily in the I'm shouting at you from the stage kind of way. We're talking about noise in the notification, cell phone buzzing, pager alerts, et cetera type. And the reason this is important because your brain never turns off, right? We evolved growing up and being around things, even in the early days. We needed to be able to process our environment. We needed to know if predator over there and predator over there was, who's the worst threat? Do we need to run down the middle? Do we need to zigzag? You know, so we're taking in this information. Now in a modern environment, the way this impacts us is a little different, right? How many of you have lived with another human, spouse, siblings, parents, et cetera? Right? How many of you suddenly found yourself a secondary expert on whatever their hobby of whatever is? Maybe you suddenly know about food science or dogs or whatever. Anybody? Right. You never looked that stuff up ever, but they're over here. And now you know, even if you wish you didn't. And this actually costs time. And so, you know, in a home environment, when people are just chatting kind of ambiguously and it's just kind of your background radiation, that's one thing. But when you're at work, let's say Joe developer needs to lock up, you know, and he says, hey, what's the Wi-Fi password? And you're like, I don't know, DevOps days, TO. And he walks away. And that actually disrupts you from whatever you were doing. So if you're not at a conference and you're actually trying to, you know, get work done in a work environment, maybe you're doing something like scaling out Kubernetes or maintenance or what have you. So that quick interruption that doesn't actually cause you to derail tasks and start a completely different one, you still have been distracted and you have to recenter and refocus on what you were doing before. You have to rebuild the mental model. You have to get to the same state you were in before, but now that state has been interrupted. And there's actually been a study that was done by Gloria Mark who actually figured out how much time you lose for these little tiny interruptions, and it's 25 minutes. That's on average how long it's going to take you to recover from what's the Wi-Fi password, which is unfortunate. A lot of it's unfortunate. I might say that a lot. You'll also notice that there's a quality degradation, right? So Spider-Man is who we're picking on now. So you have something that you're working on, and you might say, why are there so many bugs in my code? How many times were you asked for the Wi-Fi password, though, when you think about it? And it's a joke, but not really. Because when you're trying to write something that's highly complicated, or you're working with other humans, and now you're basically working as a brain trust on a singular problem, interrupting any one of those very delicate paths of communication actually can be very disruptive. And then you might notice things like, oh no, our QA guy was on a sabbatical and we didn't replace him. Now there's atrophy in our code base, and we notice the error rate's increasing over time. Right? Because there's no one protecting us from the distractions that we have just by working. You'll also notice if you try to fix these problems by saying, okay, I can't stop the noise, I can't stop them from asking me about the Wi-Fi password, so I'm going to try to multitask. How many of you have tried to multitask to get through a day? And how many times did that work out well? It usually doesn't. Most brains are not wired to handle multitasking well. And they actually did yet another study. This one was at Michigan. And what they did is they actually took a very simple task. And they had someone doing repetitive, like sentence writing type tasks. Think Bart Simpson on the chalkboard. And he's writing the same sentence over and over. But then they did the quick interruption thing. And what they found out is the error rate tripled. So your error rate goes up because you're trying to multitask, because you're trying to listen to the question that somebody's asking you while just doing something as simple as writing the same sentence over and over. And that's with something simple. Now try and imagine in your head what it's like when that happens when something's much more complicated, like a system or a cluster, or if you're in an AWS environment, multiple VPCs and all these things that are highly complicated, very distributed. And you're going to see that it actually doesn't scale well at all. So what do? We know that noise is dangerous for us, it's dangerous for our code, it's dangerous for our infrastructure. So how do we take care of it? The goal is to not be overwhelmed. So you know the noise is coming, and so you kind of got to prepare for that noise. And the way you can prepare for it is kind of determine where it's coming from. If you notice that certain systems are more chatty than others, maybe pipe that noise a little bit differently. You need to categorize it so that you know, okay, well, I work on infrastructure, and you work on databases, and you work on this. And make sure the people are being notified appropriately, rather than just sending a single carte blanche response to everyone, regardless of whether or not they can take action on it. You can workflow around your noise. Workflows are very helpful, especially in an emergency situation. I know we've already had some talks about incident command and these types of things. And the analogy I like to give for this is actually, how many people are familiar deeply with cars, right? How cars work. Dearth of hands. How many people would like to know how to change a tire if they got a flat? So you go and buy your car, and maybe the dealer or car salesman shows you, like, okay, here's your spare tire. This is how you change it. You've gotten that information once, never practice it again. And in the 4 years it takes for your tire to actually become flat, you don't know what to do with it now. And this is why workflows and practice and things are important, because you don't want to lose the practice, because the goal is for the errors to be rare, and you don't want them to be so rare that you're reinventing the process every time it happens. So as a simple diagram, this is kind of what it looks like. I realize I'm using the legacy Slack logo here, but we're going to go with it. So you have a very simple system with basic infrastructure, basic version control, and things chatting with each other, but you can already see that the arrows are going nuts over there. And you can also see there's this little person on the side, and you wonder, what's this person doing? Being noisy. If you've ever had to check your email, check your phone, spouse or someone asks you to pick up milk on the way home, or anything like that, you get a text message because Eurovision, I don't know, whatever you chat about, this is actually interrupting your workday. And if you think back to that 25 minutes, if someone's asking you to take home or bring home some milk, it's going to have the same 25-minute impact as Joe asking you the Wi-Fi password. That's disruptive. And realistically, you probably only need to know to bring home the milk on your way out. You don't need to know, in the middle of the morning when you're just trying to have your coffee and boot your brain. So when you're trying to limit your own noise, you need to protect your own space as well, because you're the one that knows your space. And this goes both with friends and colleagues, but also to your greater ecosystem of communication. If you want people to know that you're focusing on your work for the next 4 hours, they're not going to psychically know that unless you tell them, in which case it's no longer psychic, right? You've just communicated a boundary. You've said, okay, I need to work on this project that's due between the hours of 2 and 4 p.m. And then people can know, unless it's critically important in which case you tell them what critically important means. You know, it's either mom's in the hospital if it's a personal issue maybe, or if it's a work issue, production's on fire. But then for that 2-hour window, you can reasonably expect genuine silence. And you don't have to be anxious squidward about it. You can actually trust that that's fine, and you can actually focus on your work instead of having a background hamster wheel wondering if someone's like waiting to ask you something, and that there's something happening you just don't know, like Target, which is unfortunate. When you're setting the boundaries, make sure they're reasonable, right? If you're setting a boundary that's too high for people to reasonably expect, or if you always say yes, or conversely always are saying no, then people won't actually know how to gauge how to approach you. And that can be problematic when you're trying to protect your space, because you're also relying on them to know how to approach you, right? So you just need to teach them how to do that. But going back to external sources of noise, like PagerDuty, this goes to the categorization, right? So before I started doing public speaking, I was actually an SRE. So when I was an SRE, we were using products like PagerDuty, and I was managing infrastructure. So the things that I cared about were related to AWS, and anything that sits in it, and anything that manages it, and anything that alerts on those things. But there are other people too, right? There are people who are developing the mobile app, the web app, people who are specifically interested in the data scientists, like the data itself rather than what's running it, and so on and so forth. So there are all these different people with all their different interests. And going back to what I said before, we don't all need to know the same information, not to the same level of detail. So when you're looking at these like false positives, false negatives, make sure that the alerts that are going out make sense. And make sure that when you're starting to categorize, if you notice something's chatty, it's chatty in the right direction, or if something needs to be reconfigured, that it's reconfigured in a way that is actually logically consistent with how you're expecting it to notify you. To continue on, you know, when you know what needs to be known and where it needs to go, this can also go and help me, the infrastructure specialist, not, you know, kill all of Slack or put my Mac in D&D mode, because I'm expecting to get alerts from Sense, which is what, you know, one of the BI tools. I don't want to see that. I can't take action on it. If something's wrong over there, I can't help with it. Meanwhile, if I know that I'm only going to get infrastructure alerts, then I'm going to make sure that those things are coming loud and clear. And they're going to only come as loud and clear as they should. I'm not going to be woken up at 4 a.m. because the database isn't using too much memory. I'm going to be woken up at 4 a.m. when traffic's not routing correctly. And going into not creating too much noise, we're going to sidestep and talk a little bit about redundancy as well, because you can't trust a single source all the time. And I'm going to pick on Slack because they're generally a reliable tool, and because I love them. It's a love-hate relationship, right? Distracts me. But Slack a couple of summers ago had actually a major outage in the middle of the workday, at least for American, like North American time zones. You know, and 3 hours is a massive outage, very uncharacteristic of them. But if you take a step back, let's say that I, at a small startup, have most things piping into Slack. That's a single point of failure to me. If I haven't designed that in a way that my alerts and notifications can go out of Slack and maybe even just redirect to email or something, then that means that when Slack is down, my single point of notification is down. And when their single point of notification is down, instead of relying on tools that are highly tuned to do that job, like PagerDuty and things like that, you're relying on human ops. And how many people like waiting to hear about a production outage from a person? Anyone? Dirt the pants? Excellent. So this is not something we want. We want to design a system that's flexible enough that if a tool goes down, we can recover from that, we can direct around it. And if we notice that a tool that maybe used to be reliable is no longer, that we can actually architect and build something new in there and replace it. And this goes back to trust, right? If you know that you can go around a tool, if you can switch your endpoints, if you have reevaluated the reliability of your services, then you know that when silence is truly silent, and you're not trusting your noise and being anxious and wondering if there's just something you don't know, which is, you know, very common, especially in the startup world, because you maybe are inheriting a system that you're unfamiliar with or that's new and jittery. And as a final but important note, in order to keep things flowing easily, sometimes you need to make sure that you're checking that your alerts are actually consistent with your app building or your infrastructure modifications. And by that I mean you don't want an alert that maybe was triggering on a heartbeat that starts to fail just because you've redirected where that is in version 2 of your API. So when you're reevaluating noise, if that alert triggers because you forgot to modify it, happens, you can either know whether or not you need to delete it or just modify it so that you're not getting alerts for systems that might be changed or no longer even there, right, as you've architected around. Normally, I recommend that people do this in a regular way, either in their sprint cadence or something else that makes sense, because if you're doing it regularly, you're never going to be caught in that trap. You're like, oh, I need to redesign my whole monitoring system because I just let it fall so far behind my actual production app. For those who like to take pictures of resources, these are the studies that went into this presentation for the 25 minutes and the degradation of performance and the multitasking, if you guys want to actually take a look at those. Mandatory tenets of SRE. Might drop right there. If you would like a copy of the slides, I have them on Notice. Thank you for your time and attention. And I hope you guys continue to enjoy the conference. And I believe we have time for questions. So it's interesting. So the question is, I talked about Slack because it's resilient, but what happens if you've designed a system that is less resilient and then, oh no, you realize that your backups fail? And it's interesting because I actually touched on this a little bit in the On-Call Nightmares podcast I did with Jay just yesterday, because the nightmare I relayed was a situation that was pretty much exactly like that. And it did include a situation where the backups did fail. And unfortunately, when you have either corrupted or degraded backups, once you find yourself in that situation, you really are just going to have your pants on fire and have to work through it. But your response after that would be never again. And so you do have to, at that point, architect and make sure that you're putting something in where you're regularly testing backups so that you know what you have is actually working. Because, of course, the time to discover that your backups are corrupted is not when your production database just dropped. Right? There's no good answer for how to fix something that was broken going in. I have heard of cases where people just don't back up as regular as they ought, or more recently I overheard a story where someone actually turned off their production backups to save $10 a month on AWS S3, and that was unfortunate. I say that was unfortunate is like the most neutral way I can not combatively address that concern, right? There's no way to make a backup reappear, though. So once it's corrupted or lost, you have to just deal with it in real time, fortunately. Open space environments. So the question is, background radiation and an open office plan. Who works at an open office plan? Yeah, they're pretty, right? So when you're talking about protecting your space, you have to kind of get a very like stop right now attitude to your space. Sometimes that involves putting up little mechanisms, very little barriers in your space. And I don't necessarily mean physical barriers like making a cube where there's not one, but just something that signals to people that you're trying to focus. And that might be something as simple as on your, like beside your monitor, like a D&D sign that's actually visible to other people besides you. It might be something as simple as sending out an email, or if you guys have that office plan where you have like a little, I hesitate to call them like phone booths, but they kind of look like them, right? They're like little protected spaces, usually for conference calls, and you can hop into one of those. Open office plans are really kind of difficult to navigate for this reason, but with communication, you can help yourself at least a little bit. And people aren't normally trying to force themselves into your space. Normally, people are just unaware that you need space, and you just need to help them. As a caveat to that, a lot of people like to wear headphones with no music playing so they look busy. Who does that? That's why it doesn't work. So I mean, feel free to do that if you don't want to hear other people because they're noise canceling, but it's not going to signal to somebody that you're busy either. Happy lunch.
Okay.